moderators. We can't move to lunch until we get this next session done. Is that not motivation? Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Before I introduce the person who's going to start us off in our last morning session, I just want to give a special shout out also to CoBank for being an executive sponsor. We can't say thank you enough to all of these sponsors and and how important their contributions and support is. So thank you to CoBank. And then with that, yes, we can do more than say thank you. I'm going to introduce Aaliyah Ned, NCBA CLUS's Director of Government Relations, to launch a session about federal funding.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited to kick off our next session on implementing new federal legislation. Going back to the conversations that we had a few years ago with folks on this very stage, we discussed some of the challenges facing cooperatives, starting with the CARES Act and the rollout of the $2 billion in PPP and EIDL funds. For the first time in a widespread way, co-ops were able to leverage the Small Business Administration's lending programs due to them waiving the prohibitive personal guarantee requirement. That simply doesn't align with the cooperative model, where all member owners across the board have equal rights within the democratic governance process. And we also highlighted challenges with the rollout of those programs and within the federal government more broadly in navigating and responding quickly to the coronavirus pandemic, and now shifting into that economic recovery, and we continue this work, particularly as folks across the board understood the importance of having a reliable internet connection and broadband in rural communities where sometimes an online app was the only way to access these programs. And the bipartisan infrastructure law provided significant investments to address our broadband infrastructure and bridge the digital divide, as well as address our nation's aging infrastructure in a major way. And the work to achieve equitable and more resilient communities through climate and environmental justice was recognized through passage of the Inflation Reduction Act last year. Throughout all of these challenges, cooperatives, due to our unique structure and the cooperative difference, continue to be nimble and resilient in responding quickly to adapt to these challenges across sectors, from agriculture to rural electrics, worker cooperatives through the CHIPS and Science Act, housing, food co-ops, and our lending partners within credit unions and community development financial institutions. Cooperatives continue to be on the front lines and well-positioned to create more equitable and sustainable communities through shared ownership. As we approach new challenges, such as the silver tsunami of small business owners retiring and leveraging the momentum within specific sectors, as we just discussed in the last session, and continue to address the climate crisis in partnership or cooperation, we have immense opportunities, and our work is just beginning. Looking ahead, Congress has some major ticket items to get done in the coming months and throughout the next year. And we want to bridge that gap between leveraging these new opportunities, seeing how the cooperative business model can be injected as a solution for policymakers, while also taking advantage of the existing funding streams in partnership with each other and local governments. So I'm pleased to introduce the panelists for the next session to talk about their work around implementing federal programs and how the cooperative ecosystem can create meaningful partnerships at all levels. And I'll tell you a little bit about them as they come on stage. So with us today, we have Dan Brissett, president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, or EESI, a nonprofit education and policy organization. Dan's professional background has centered around energy policy and energy efficiency, and we're thankful to continue this work in partnership with EESI. Next is Kathy Mann, who served as the president and CEO, has served as the president and CEO of Inclusive since 2012. Inclusive is a certified intermediary, CDFI, and network of community development credit unions who are mobilizing their members to leverage these new funding streams. And we also have Karen Tyler Ruiz. Karen serves as the executive director of the Center for Community-Based Enterprise, Inc. in Detroit, Michigan, also known as C2BE, which supports the creation of people-centered businesses. So thank you all for being here today.
Thank you.
And to start us off, we've heard over the past few days about folks' approaches and leveraging the cooperative business model, and we've seen how folks come to co-ops and the co-op ecosystem through a variety of backgrounds and now use that in their work or have that connection in their work in different ways. So to start us off, I would love to hear a little bit more about your connection to co-ops, starting with you, Dan.
Sure thing, Aaliyah, and Kathy and Karen. It's nice to be with you today, and thanks for the invitation. And these chairs are way comfier than I expected. They really kind of sink down in there. So Environmental and Energy Study Institute, we're based here in Washington, and we sort of have two lines of business. The first is policymaker education. Next year, we'll be celebrating our 40th year of providing nonpartisan, science-based educational resources to members of Congress and their staff about environmental, energy, and climate challenges. That's kind of our first line of business. About a little bit more than 10 years ago, we developed some expertise around some programs being run out of the Department of Agriculture, specifically the Rural Energy Savings Program. You heard Willie Lyles talk a little bit earlier about that when he accepted the award on behalf of Representative Clyburn. So those are two sort of the paths, the vectors that we've taken over the years to work with co-ops. I'll admit that a lot of the work we do in the co-op space is in rural areas because rural electric co-ops in particular is sort of where I would say most closely connected to the broader community. But we work with co-ops in a few different ways. The first is by featuring the work of co-ops in our congressional education. South Carolina, Washington State, Colorado, co-ops, other organizations that work with co-ops and co-op ecosystems around the country. We like to feature them. Aaliyah in particular is a veteran of EESI briefings, so NCBA, CLUSA, as well as NRECA, bringing co-op voices to a congressional audience is kind of the first way we interact. The second is we work together very closely around federal policy priorities that we share. So I mentioned the Rural Energy Savings Program. Annual appropriations is a high priority of ours. Mutual, along with NRECA. We're working together right now on Farm Bill and things like that as well to try to keep programs that co-ops can access accessible. And then finally is that technical assistance where we actually work with co-ops, largely facilitating networking opportunities between co-ops to share information about inclusive financing opportunities that are repaid on the customer's electric bill. So we're really pleased to get a chance to work with co-ops so much and to have an opportunity to talk with you a little bit about it today. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And financing and networking is very much within Inclusive wheelhouse, Kathy, so would love to hear about your connection and your work.
Yeah, thanks, Aaliyah, and thank you for asking me to be on this fabulous panel. With Inclusive, we are a national network of community development credit unions, and so as such, we are a network that is very fundamentally focused on the cooperative model as the ideal means for delivering capital to communities that have historically been underserved by traditional banking systems, by traditional banks and the financial system as a whole. So Inclusive as the network, we have this mission of working with and through the cooperatives, the credit unions, to advance financial inclusion and equity. We also are certified as a CDFI intermediary. And so while our network of community development credit unions, the vast majority of them have this certification by US Treasury as a CDFI, which means that their predominant business activity is serving low-income and underserved communities. we also at Inclusive are certified as a CDFI, which means it gives us the ability to raise and deploy capital to build and strengthen the work of the credit unions on the ground. And I'll say, we'll talk a lot about sort of the opportunities involved with being able to access federal sources of funds and even state and local sources of funds by really leaning into that core mission. I tend to be a true believer that we are the solution to so many of the social and economic problems that legislators and government officials face and are trying to solve for, and that half of the time we just need to reinforce and let them know that we exist, we're here, and that's what we are sort of set up to do. And I'll just quickly say that, sort of another aspect of what Inclusive does is also as a training, technical assistance, and sort of network organization, we really do spend a lot of time making sure our members articulate well the concept of what a cooperative really is and what local ownership and control of community assets really means. And so I'll say, that's sort of a big part of our kind of member education is really trying to make sure we're really living and breathing the cooperative ethos through the delivery of the services.
Yeah, and you all do incredibly important work, and co-ops as a solution and community-based ownership is also core to the work of Inclusive as well as C2BE. So would love to hear about your work, Karen, and your ties to cooperatives.
Well, thank you for having me as well on this panel. C2BE is the Center for Community-Based Enterprise. I like to say that really slow because people always go, what is it? C2BE, and we deliberately chose that name versus cooperative because we have a broad view of any type of community-based enterprise, a social enterprise, a cooperative, which is the majority of the work that we do, but we wanted to make sure we could have a conversation with the entire community, and so that's why we have that name. We're the practitioner here on the panel, so we're on the ground. We are a cooperative, we're developers, so we're in that space. And we have a couple buckets of our work: technical assistance for creating new community-based enterprises or co-ops. We work, a larger portion of our work is current businesses, existing businesses, and transitioning them into worker co-op, which means we have to get to those businesses and do succession planning, and so they even understand that this is a possibility because they typically don't even consider that. And then, of course, outreach and education, and we include organizing in there as part of the Solidarity Network. And then we also serve as a fiscal agent for our for-profit clients, only our clients, so that we many times actually get, sometimes it's a foundation and sometimes it's a donor that wants to provide support because they believe in the CBE, the community-based enterprise or cooperative community, and they provide resources, and we will hold that money and then pass it through to the for-profit. So that's another line of business that we have.
And I think all of you mentioned education and training, which we know is one of our cooperative principles and has been highlighted throughout our sessions over the past few days. And ensuring that folks are well equipped to meet the moment. Whether that's building partnerships or understanding the current lay of the land or even reaching out to the member owners of the cooperatives that you work with is integral to all of your work. So Karen, going back to you here, talk to me about those partnerships that you built, particularly in leveraging new federal resources and that succession planning through your partnerships.
Thanks. Yeah, well, this is exciting for us, and it's new for us. We, in 2022, received a contract from a quasi-governmental, so it's ARPA resources funding through the quasi-economic development entity, to provide succession planning and transitional support up, not exactly getting them through the full transition, but just getting them close to Ingham County, which is where our capital is in Michigan. That's where we're based. And it is new for us to work in partnership with an economic development quasi-governmental entity. This is really very wonderful for us. And something that is very, very new that we just got word while we were here is that we have been working diligently both from a policy and a relational and a resource opportunity with the state of Michigan in the SSBCI, the State Small Business, what's the C? Credit Initiative, thank you. I just have to like think of that. And we went in as a consortium with 3 other organizations so that we could do more of the state. We alone covered this much, and so each one of us brought some footprint to the state, went in as a consortium, and we just got word we were awarded some of that resources, so that's kind of amazing.
Worth a round of applause. Congratulations.
So if you talk about the relationships, on the quasi-governmental side for the succession planning work, that was interesting because those ARPA resources, when they started to flow, we had just done a business plan. And so part of the business plan was to reach out to governmental jurisdictions and quasis to see if they could utilize our services. We had never done that before, so it was a full business plan. And one of the things that we have great staff, I don't know if you know, but Terry Lewis, I have the wonderful opportunity to work alongside her. So actually looked, thank you, at the ARPA resources, and staff looked at the ARPA resources and actually saw how much each jurisdiction was going to get. So we started having conversations with them and said, did you know you're going to get $75 million? And they were like, what? We would like give them the very precise number. And so they were like, oh my God, how do you know what we don't know? So again, we weren't talking to mayors, we were talking to the economic developers. And they hadn't just, you know how it takes a minute, but we kind of did it on purpose. So that we could start a conversation that maybe we wouldn't have not gotten into before. And then that just led to doing that over and over with different jurisdictions, and one of them was already in the space of thinking about succession planning, and it was a good match. So, yeah.
That's incredible. And just congratulations to you all for going through that process and walking us through the steps of where to begin in creating those partnerships, particularly as there's more of a regional focus on funding, whether that's RCDG or the Appalachian Regional Commission, or just within your own networks and communities. So congratulations on winning that award. And being able to mobilize your folks and telling your co-op story is really the first step there. So I would love to hear from you, Kathy, as you all are mobilizing your members in a very strong way, what that process looks like for you all.
Yeah, and kudos, Karen, on the cracking the nut of SSBCI. I feel like there's a whole workshop or series of workshops really we should do across all cooperatives on like how do we get access to that, because that is just such an important amount of resources that have gone to the states, and I don't know that we've gotten that much successes there. So I'll say a little bit of like traditionally where we've mobilized as the network of community development credit unions around mobilizing resources to ensure that credit unions participate in the CDFI fund, which is the fund at the Treasury Department, the Community Development Financial Institutions Fund, Inclusive, which used to be known as the National Federation of Community Development Credit Unions, was instrumental in getting the CDFI fund set up under the Clinton administration back in 1996 and advocating to make sure it was expanded to all types of financial institutions. The original vision was to create a bunch of community development banks around the country. And ever since then, Inclusive has really been active in making sure credit unions know about the fund, know that there are resources available if your credit union is focused predominantly on serving communities that have not historically been well served by the banking system. So you have to have a 60% or more of your business activity in low-income communities, in communities of color, and in other communities that have demonstrated historical lack of access and discrimination. And that has been something that over time we've built up, a lot of momentum. It started off with a small group of very, grassroots credit unions that were, working towards, getting the certification and accessing some of the funds. But in recent years, as more and more credit unions, I believe, have really embraced their mission, have been able to expand maybe beyond traditional charters that maybe limited them only to serving specific subsegments of their communities, and now have gone community-wide. There's a lot more credit unions that are really engaged in what does it take for me to orient my institution towards the original mission and work of what we were chartered to do. So, so I think that's been a real big part of it. And then, a huge part of what our work has been at the federal level. During the pandemic, we helped to mobilize the network of credit unions to step in to be delivering PPP loans. And so, I think across the entire credit union movement, more than $5 billion of PPP loans were originated by credit unions, and that's not just the community development credit unions, but certainly it enabled dollars to get out that never would have gotten out if we were just relying on the banking system or on fintechs, right? We were able to get it out with a lot of technical assistance, a lot of engagement with businesses that needed to get access to it, but probably needed a lot of extra steps to be able to manage some of the documentation requirements. So that's been a really big piece. And as a result, there is a real acknowledgement of the importance of having this really deep, organic banking, financial system infrastructure in place. And so under the CARES Act, there was $12 billion that was allocated to a range of community development and a range of community development financial institutions and MDIs, minority depository institutions. So over $12 billion, $3 billion of which went through the CDFI fund in the form of grants, and then another $9 billion went through Treasury as long-term loans, and we were able to effectively get credit unions to organize CDFI credit unions and MDI credit unions to be able to organize and be able to access those funds. And now we've sort of engaged in this really bigger effort of trying to support as our members are going through how they create solutions to climate events and to the crisis of, the climate crisis, but also the very real and immediate issues of environmental degradation and pollution and poor air quality in their communities by being able to access capital through EPA's Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I know Dan's got a lot to say on that too.
And I want to uplift a few things you said there, Kathy, particularly in remaining rooted in folks' mission and reminding them. And those seem to be the keys in why credit unions were so agile in being able to deploy those PPP loans efficiently with those relationships that were established with member owners and having that infrastructure. And now, as we look to climate change, having all of those key components is really putting the cooperative community in a well-poised position to move forward here. And Dan, on the member piece of it, EESI's work in increasing resiliency and those partnerships that you have with rural electric co-ops, would love to hear a little bit about the infrastructure piece, which is the bread and butter of your work.
Yeah, happy to do that. Maybe to start, just why? Like, why would an organization like EESI spend so much time and effort thinking about this? And there's a couple really important reasons. And the first is that rural areas are really important. They're important politically, and you saw that demonstrated this morning. Representative Clyburn represents a rural district. Senator Hoeven represents a rural state. That's different parts of the political spectrum, but they both had representatives here or were here to talk about how great co-ops are. And so keeping tabs of the cool work happening in rural areas is something that helps us go. Also, there's something called a rural energy burden, and you talked about climate change, and we're not going to address we're not going to address the climate crisis with the urgency it deserves if we're not able to ensure that everyone in the United States is able to participate. And there are specific challenges in rural areas, especially disadvantaged rural areas, that make it harder for people to electrify their homes or to weatherize their homes or to participate in new workforce opportunities, things like that. And so we have to make sure that just because someone spends, in a rural area, spends 40% more of their income on their energy bill than their urban counterparts, that they're able to have opportunities to overcome that. And it's important that they have a chance to do that. And then finally, there's cool work happening in co-ops in rural areas. And we want to bring success stories to Capitol Hill. We want to talk about interesting and innovative things being done. And so on the infrastructure side, that's kind of manifested, those sort of three things have manifested themselves at EESI. The first is what we call the Beneficial Electrification Toolkit. This is an online resource. You can visit it online at betoolkit.org. And it's really an online resource designed to help the Rural Electric Cooperative Program Manager work start to finish about how do they design programs for their members to help them electrify, to help them save money on their energy bill, to help them have a more comfortable home and all of that. From development, from just blue sky thinking all the way to evaluation. That was launched last summer before the Inflation Reduction Act happened. So you better believe that in August, 2 months after we launched it, we said, oh wait, there's all these rebates and tax incentives that are coming through largely state energy offices or the Treasury Department. How are rural co-ops going to understand all of these opportunities? They're trusted sources of information in their communities. And so we've had to think a lot about how we take that online resource and make it relevant to co-op program managers who are trying to explain these programs to members or working with contractors in their service territories. And there's billions and billions and billions of dollars coming down the pike, whether they're through rebates or tax incentives. So this is a really important opportunity that's going to change the infrastructure, the utility infrastructure, but also the buildings infrastructure, commercial and residential in rural areas. And if we do it right, well, then we'll have a lot fewer greenhouse gas emissions, which is a good thing. If we do it wrong, well, then we've just spent billions of dollars not making things better in a really critical decade for climate change. And then the last thing is, I know we'll talk about this, sort of a little bit more going forward too, but at some point there's going to be a farm bill. I'm not going to, I'm not going to give my over/under of when I think we'll see text, but it'll happen in the future. But that's a really important opportunity as well to improve rural infrastructure and to set rural infrastructure up to participate in climate action over the next 5 or so years of the next Farm Bill authorization. And that infrastructure, once it's there, well, it's going to be there and it'll be leveraged going forward for a much longer period of time.
And leveraged for a longer period of time, capturing that resiliency sounds to be a through line for all of you. So to pose the question to all of you, what are the opportunities that you see for that resiliency, whether that's community wealth building, succession planning, technical assistance? I would love to open the question up to all of our panelists here.
So I'll maybe jump in sort of with segueing from the Inflation Reduction Act. Like, I think there was a kind of a stroke of genius that so much of this climate work got established under the Inflation Reduction Act. And I know when I think about the credit union movement and that our part of the cooperative movement, if we were to be thinking about, okay, now it's time for credit unions to go off and think about climate and how do you reduce greenhouse gas emissions, I think our response would be, yeah, that's really important. We all know we're all in this together and we have a lot of urgency, but we have all these immediate needs that we have to serve our members to get them into greater financial stability, greater financial security. And I think the fact that, to Dan's point, all these rebates and all these credits, along with a good amount of capital for lenders coming in under the Inflation Reduction Act, is enabling us to create that perfect intersection between helping lenders having lenders be able to help households who may want to do the right thing, may want to, make their homes more efficient, may want to be able to, have solar energy generated, may want to drive electric vehicles because they know the gas guzzling vehicles are creating this crisis, but they have very tight margins and they haven't been able to see a way to affordably engage in climate action. And one of the beautiful things with the Inflation Reduction Act is there's a ton of credits and rebates that kind of kickstart that process. Because one of the things that we see with credit unions, and we do a lot of financial coaching, is once we can get you into a clean energy loan, once we can get you with a loan to be able to do the energy efficiency retrofits of your home, to be able to, reduce some of that, that energy seepage, to get you into the ability to generate solar, to get you into electric vehicles, your costs, your monthly budget costs go way down. And one of the things we think a lot about is, how do we design loans so that your monthly loan payment is going to be less than the amount of energy costs you've reduced in your household budget. So we used to do, in financial coaching, we used to spend a lot of time going like, okay, how do we reduce this budget to help you be able to live with, the earnings you have? And there was always like, rent and utilities was always as if it's like just a constant. Oh, it's just a number. What's that plug? Let's plug that in. Well, now we can actually have conversations about that utility line on your household budget and go, let's think about, is there a way that the credit union could design some, can get you into some loans that will help you move into, upgrading some of your appliances in your home, your washer, dryer, your refrigerators, getting into heat pumps, which are now becoming much more affordable. When the price point comes down with EVs, getting you into an EV and getting rid of that $50 to $60 a week you're paying in gas, and be able to get you into a much more affordable lifestyle of being able to get to your job, which might be an hour and a half away, and be able to do it without bankrupting yourself to just get there, to be able to get to be able to earn the money to support the budget. So there's a lot of spaces where I feel like we've been able to now see that. And our job is to like tie it all together, pull down these resources, and really be resource hubs for making sure people who most need those advantages are getting them. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us, but there's a lot of great opportunity. One of the opportunities is the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, which is $27 billion that lenders could be plugging into. Sorry, I took a little too long on that one.
Go ahead, Karen.
No, I was going to say I have a lot less to say than that. Honestly, as I heard both of you speaking, C2BE as a practitioner on the ground, it took a lot of our bandwidth to shepherd the SSBCI conversations that staff, you got to keep talking to the state and make sure. We tried to get them to put the word cooperative in there, and we did not get that, but we did get them to recognize that there's a role out there for us. Between that and the succession planning ARPA fund, we have not done a lot with the newest tranche of money because with no bandwidth. At the same time, I want to say though, the work that we have been able to do, which means we will probably get there eventually, but I don't know how fast, is we've used all of the work of the networks that we've generated inside of the cooperative community, so the folks in the room. There were lots of write-ups on SSBCI when it first came out. We took all of those, read them, then we repurposed them and put our, Detroit and Michigan spin on it, and then got it to our policymakers. Same with ARPA, just paying attention to what the networks that, and again, in this room, Cooperation Works, Workers to Owners from Dowie, all these groups, we use their policy information to help us make smart decisions. So we're standing on other folks and we understand that. So we use those networks. Currently, we have not started in this new tranche of money because we're implementing on those two pieces, but I'm sure we'll figure out a way. But again, we're gonna look to the networks of folks in this room to see what you're doing and to see if there's some way we can get engaged with the cooperative world in these spaces that make sense for us.
Well, I'd like to go back to something that Kathy said and sort of the secret sauce of the Inflation Reduction Act, right? You've all heard there's carrots and there's sticks. Well, the Inflation Reduction Act is very carrot flavored. It's not stick flavored at all, really. It's really all designed about getting people to do things that they would otherwise really like to do. And all of the clean energy incentives, really, that I can think of, are things that people will like, and once they get, they'll want more of. So they'll really like their induction cooktops. They'll really like their electric vehicles. They'll really like their new insulation. They'll like all of that stuff. And so in rural areas in particular, how do people find out about it? It's motivating a lot of what we do because co-op the rural electric co-op is sort of an obvious source of that information. And also there are things the co-op can do, whether it's inclusive financing, non-financial incentives, working with contractors to make those incentives sort of really happen. And then sort of back to something that Karen was saying, right? Like, we're kind of not there yet, right? The reason why you haven't maybe started working on it is because they're not really there yet. It's like buying an avocado, right? You buy an avocado at grocery shopping on Saturday or Sunday, and you're like, how hard does this thing need to be for me to eat it on Wednesday, right? Like, how do I tee this up so that when I make fajitas on Wednesday, I can have avocado on it? And there's the first week you're going to get it wrong, but eventually you do it enough, and you kind of figure out like, oh, that's a squeezable avocado. That's going to be ready for me. So what do we do in the meantime, right? How do we tee ourselves up for this? And there's some really important things that we're doing. One is just keeping track of it, putting resources out there for policymakers, but also for co-ops. Working on the Farm Bill so that when the Farm Bill is authorized, whenever that happens to be, programs like the Rural Energy Savings Program are ready to go and more accessible to more co-ops. So Representative Clyburn, if he had been here today, he probably would have talked a little bit about the Rural Energy Savings Act, which is a top priority of ours, as well as NRECA and the Farm Bill. And that would make capacity building more available to co-ops. It would allow co-ops to make loans outside of, strictly speaking, rural areas if their service territory has evolved over time and may become more suburban. Make some really important tweaks like that. And then there's that capacity building. So we've also been working with co-ops on the two new USDA programs, PACE and New Era. We've supported $3 billion of applications. Those $3 billion, if those applications are successful, are going to make an enormous difference in the physical infrastructure with rural energy cooperatives towards a clean energy future, and that's really, really important. But then also back to the homeowners piece, right? The members. How on earth is a member going to keep up with all of this stuff? How are they going to understand, well, I can get this rebate, but I can't get the tax incentive? Well, those two things, those are good things that should go together. And so making sure that our resources are teed up in a way to help co-ops explain those differences, also help contractors and others kind of pull all of those things together because, you know, we're sort of at that edge, right? We're sort of on a precipice of all these really great things, but they're not quite there yet. But once they're there, people are going to want to snap them up real fast. And so it's on us to be as prepared as possible.
Yes, and that preparation is key to laying the foundation and making sure that folks across the board have the infrastructure that's needed to leverage it when that moment does happen, as you said, Dan. And as we see these resources flowing from the federal to state to local governments, keeping a lens towards ensuring that it's applied and implemented in an equitable way is something that I heard all of you say, working directly with low-income households and rural communities and low-income neighborhoods and business owners, and inclusion and equity and building that capacity for folks to be ready to meet the moment. Part of what I heard all of you say is that you're working within your networks and within the ecosystem writ large. So would love to hear your sort of lightning round thoughts on those cross-sector connections on how we can achieve those shared priorities and create collaborative proposals.
I'll go if you don't mind, because I always work in this space of disparate stuff connecting, and I think listening, even just listening right here with the panel, I'm already like, okay, so I might talk to a couple people that I hadn't thought about initially, just to see what they're already going to work on in the environmental space. We have a very active environmental community in Detroit. There's opportunity to have some kind of community-based formation there. So how can I tie them to these opportunities? We're very engaged with a housing partner. How can they get that bricks and mortar to have some, I know so I'm just like, okay. So I got to all of us is like, we're going to rethink how we come at it. That's to me how you get to the networks, is listening to you all, talking to folks, finding out where those opportunities are, and then just going on and exploring them. Some of them will come up, no, and some of them are going to pan out to something you may not even have thought about. So at the end of the day, it's always thinking about what's possible.
Go ahead, Kathy.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say I think in the cooperation among cooperatives, there's also like, what are our through threads, you know, and I know you talked a lot about succession planning, and we were talking about sort of the, was it the silver tsunami that's coming for small business is also a silver tsunami for each of our cooperative sectors too, you know. And so thinking about succession, you know, some of the themes that we're all grappling with, we all design our own materials, we all sort of start from scratch sometimes, but there's probably a lot of places where, building that ecosystem and sharing and engaging is really helpful. In the clean energy space, even when you think about like the business development stuff, we see when we're, lending for homeowners in certain areas, like they can't get, installers and contractors to come to their homes. They can't get folks with cultural competencies, and so kind of doing a little bit more engagement in the small business space and making sure, like, how are we connecting to make sure that those, there are businesses that can be fostered, grown, and supported that could also be then the deliverers of the services that we're looking for. Those are just a couple that come to mind.
When we work with a rural electric cooperative and we're talking to them about doing inclusive financing and clean energy program design, we're generally speaking about renewable energy, energy efficiency, battery storage, electric vehicle supply equipment, and beneficial electrification, the idea of moving to electric end uses from fossil fuel. But those are disparate, those are different things, but they go really well together. But an investment in one of those actually delivers multiple benefits. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because the co-op is kind of part of all of them. So the first is obviously affordability, right? An energy efficient home is a more affordable home. Having solar, especially accessible solar, community solar, helps lower electricity costs. And of course, with that rural energy burden, that's really, really important. But those investments also promote building resilience, and building resilience promotes grid resilience. And a grid that's happy and not stressful is a more resilient and reliable grid, and so that's something that we should all be working toward. There's also this idea of comfort and well-being, right? An energy-efficient home is a more comfortable home. It's a better home in terms of air quality. It's also a more valuable home, even though that's not always represented in the sales price. And then lastly is this, or not quite lastly, but sort of the opportunities, right? We're talking about making these investments in places where maybe there isn't an existing workforce to do the energy efficiency retrofit or the battery storage installation or the renewable energy installation, but that's the future. And so those jobs have to be created, and if there's a driver for those job opportunities, right, I could really imagine sort of an opportunity, not just for jobs, but for prosperity, and that's really what we're working toward. The other thing we're really working toward is greenhouse gas emissions reductions. You have an efficient home with solar and battery storage and electric vehicle, you're putting less CO2 in the environment, you're not polluting your community as much, and you're not polluting the environment as much. And so in the middle of all of that, the co-op obviously has a large role to play. And we want to make it as easy with our technical assistance resources and other educational resources to encourage that and to make it easier for the co-op to do what its members are asking for, but also make it easier for the members to go to the co-op and really understand what the opportunities are.
And opportunities we have abundant, especially looking towards what's out there and what's coming. But in the spirit of having conversations and learning from each other, I do want to leave time for one or two questions. So thank you all for the fantastic conversation. Are there any questions in the audience here?
I can't see a thing.
That means we did a great job.
I have no idea.
Thank you. She had to take a 3-hour tour to get to me. Hope she saved on energy. Hi, everyone. I'm Jessica Lewis of Mobile Enterprises. I actually wanted to speak to some of the things you all talked about and also give resources at the same time. So one major resource that may be in your state is PACE. It's called Property Assessed Clean Energy. So if you own residential or commercial property, this particular program is through the Department of Energy and is designed for what they mentioned today about green upgrades or retrofits. It's attached to your property tax bill. So typically some programs you have to run your credit or you may have to put up your home or property for collateral, but this one actually allows for you to use that program for these retrofits without a lot of barriers to entry. And so I was going to mention to Kathy, if you're not offering that as a program and if you have a national footprint, I can tell you that a lot of states are not tapping into that particular resource. And as a result, that's missing money. So the Department of Energy is giving out a lot of money right now. So also a great website through them is HeroX, where many of you in the co-ops that you all are participating in could use that particular resource as an opportunity to tap into grant money that the Department of Energy is giving out for some of the co-ops that y'all are participating, probably particularly along the lines of what Daniel provides as a co-op. There are tax credits for electric vehicles that are on your tax returns, so make sure our bookkeeping and accountants are in here, are tapping into that for you all. And then lastly, for those who are in certain states, go to your economic development departments and ask them about specific county tax incentives for some of the things that you are providing. And particularly, there are some experts that are doing carbon credits for a lot of the work that you all are doing. And so they didn't tap into that because maybe that wasn't so much something that was a part of the conversation, but I did want to let you guys know there are a lot of things out there. I'm in the green world, so I'm excited, as y'all can see, and I wanted to share that with you all because they're talking about things that are really important, and if you aren't incorporating green practices in your co-ops, y'all are missing out on a huge opportunity because, as he mentioned, this is the future, and unfortunately, we only have a few years left to get to these SDGs, so if y'all need assistance with that, I definitely will reach out to them, and I'm a smaller person resource. If y'all need me, I am through the Hoover app as Jessica Lewis. Thank you.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Jessica. Do we
Another
have
whole workshop there too, right? On all this, yeah, really great.
And I see there's one question down front here.
Yeah, I was glad Daniel touched on the need for workforce development as we think about electrification of the built environment. I've witnessed firsthand, we need to teach HVAC contractors how to install heat pumps and all kinds of things. And I'm curious if there's been any thought leadership from folks here or in the room about how, with this need for workforce training around energy efficiency, electrification of buildings, what opportunities are there for worker ownership in that space?
Ooh, that's a great question.
That is a great question.
I imagine there's lots. I'm not an expert in sort of what was being discussed earlier, but a lot of these, especially in the energy efficiency space, these are a lot of small employers. So you might have a handful of employees, an owner and a handful of employees, and a couple of trucks. That's kind of the sort of the energy efficiency contractor stereotype. And in a rural area where you might have to drive many miles in between your jobs, it puts a lot of stress on that company to keep up with the demand if there's too much demand. Because you can only do so many different jobs. So my guess is that there's a lot of opportunity around that. I don't know if anyone else has thoughts. But
I know one of our members, the Clean Energy Credit Union, came out of, it was a credit union that got organized from a series of cooperatives. And they do have a national footprint. I think a lot of the cooperatives are in the Southwest, but there's a tremendous opportunity to grow that everywhere. Yeah.
I think about, frankly, the union opportunity. We were approached at one time with I think it was electricals, that were interested in a potential co-op. I'll leave it at that, and figuring out how to make that happen. That's the first thing I think about. I also think about, because we're in the create space, I actually was in workforce development, did a lot of the green training at a time. And a lot of those folks did not end up in jobs, but they were trained. So it's another opportunity for the creation of a co-op around those skill sets.
yeah, just to build on Karen, what you just said is 100% right. I don't know if any of you heard this yesterday when you were up on the Hill, but sometimes the answer to the question is like, oh, well, workforce development, right? How do we get more energy efficiency in people's homes? Oh, that's workforce development. What is workforce development? Like, what does that even mean? It's not a thing, right? You're talking about people who are, maybe in grade school who will eventually go to high school and they'll want to get into the trades. It's people who might be employed in one job and they want to switch, or maybe their sector is changing and they have different needs. It's a multifaceted issue of how these things happen. And also, we tend to think about it as something that's not going to happen overnight, right? You can't just put like a workforce development module into your local economy and then, oh, everyone knows how to install an induction range, right? These are things that have to take time, and they take resources, and they also take people. And there is sort of a limit to how quickly people themselves can evolve on the customer side or on the member side, but also on the workforce side, right? Like, they can't just all start doing something differently because, well, there's still furnaces to install, or there are still, gasoline power vehicles that need repair, or things like that. We're very much in like that moment of transition. And I think workforce development is probably one of those places where we see that sort of most clearly.
And I will just mention, while it's not industry specific, the Economic Development Administration's Recompete pilot program has highlighted a number of distressed areas across the map that would support cooperative development specifically to address an aging workforce and workforce participation. That funding stream meeting the moment of this silver tsunami and small businesses closing, coming together at this time is a funding stream that could be leveraged. And while the application period is closed, the unique thing is funding will flow through regional partnerships. So having these conversations with your economic development agency, to your local governments, would be a great way to get in despite that initial round of sort of applications coming to a close. So would encourage folks to check out EDA's website just on the Recompete pilot program as a resource. And it looks like we may be the only thing standing between folks and lunch here, as much as we would love to keep the conversation going. And I have learned so much from you all, and it sounds like the room has as well. So please give a hand to our panelists today.
Thank you, Leah.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Leah.
So you now have a networking lunch, no agenda, your chance to take some of these ideas, some of these thoughts, some of the people you just met, and hook up with them and spend a little time chatting. Be back at 2 o'clock. We're going to hear about measuring DEI impact. We're going to hear from emerging co-op leaders. And we're going to have one of my favorite things, the Hall of Fame panel. So great afternoon. See you at 2.